So in terms of research question 3, and I'll deal with this a lot more quickly, we were looking at changes to understandings of teacher competence. So we looked at various language teacher competence frameworks that are out there. And there is no universal framework that works for all teachers everywhere. There's quite a lot of specific frameworks, for example, frameworks around digital competencies, frameworks for primary school teachers. And quite interestingly, not many of the frameworks, or very few of the frameworks, actually define what they mean by teacher competence. And the British Council framework doesn't even use the word competence, it uses professional practices, which personally I think is very nice. But we did see from all of these frameworks that teacher competence is something that's complex, it's dynamic, and it's action-oriented. And it's not just about knowledge, it includes knowledge and skills, but also a teacher's values and attitudes. And we also saw that some of these competencies are generalizable to all teachers everywhere, but quite a lot are actually individual and also context specific. And Anderson has written a really interesting book that looks at teacher expertise in the Global South. And this is where we see maybe that some competencies are context specific. So he talks about, for example, flexibility being a really key competence for teachers, for many teachers in the Global South, because things change so much. So maybe timetables change, student attendance changes. And so teachers need to develop this competence of flexibility. Whereas other competences, such as, for example, using group work, might not be so relevant in those contexts. Things like digital competencies, again, might not be so relevant in certain contexts. So that's the findings for phase 1. I don't know if any of those things were new to you, or whether you thought they were interesting. But what we wanted to do was test consensus with those, with actually people who are on the ground. So see if the findings that we found from the review actually resonated with practitioners, both teachers and teacher educators on the ground. So we designed a survey with the aim to test consensus, looking for things that we might want to add to the framework. This was quite short, it was quick to answer, about 10 minutes, and it was mostly multiple choice or a tick all that apply type survey. All the questions included in your context. So we wanted people to respond what was relevant with what was relevant to them in their particular context. This was distributed very widely through the British Council email list. It also went on to various Facebook, WhatsApp and Telegram groups. Quite a lot of those were based in sub-Saharan Africa. And we had 1,037 valid responses from a total of 115 countries. So I'm not going to look at all of the results of that. We're just going to look at the results, or some of the results, and the findings from the teacher education section. So in this section, we asked people to look at a list of topics. There were 16 topics in all, and I'll show you those in a minute. And we asked them to say whether they thought these were important for teachers today, whether they thought they formed a part of teachers' practice in their context, and whether they were covered in teacher education. And they could tick one or all of those three things. Or they could say that they thought none of these applied in their particular context. So this table here looks at overall consensus. So this shows the number of people who said that yes, those things were important for teachers today, and or they were included in teachers' practice, and or they were included in teacher education. So you can see that there was generally high consensus for all of the topics. Top one was assessment for learning with 98%, and teaching practice, teaching practicum. And if we go down, we can see that maybe those 4 at the bottom, there wasn't quite so much consensus. So multi-plurilingual practices were considered not very applicable in 10% of the contexts. Teacher professional identity in 11, artificial intelligence 12, learner agency in 14% of the contexts. So maybe this is because, particularly in terms of artificial intelligence, when we did this just a year ago, artificial intelligence had only been around for about a year. Maybe teachers hadn't really cottoned on to how that was being used. That might have changed by now, of course. Learner agency, maybe they felt that in many contexts in the world, actually learners don't have much agency, and therefore that was not really applicable to them. If we then look at these ideas in a little bit more detail. So in this table here, we've got the percentage of people in that second column who thought that this topic is important for language teachers today. And then in the next column, the number of people, the percentage of people who thought that this topic is part of teachers' practice today. So we can see that there's a bit of a difference there between the things that people think is actually important and actually how many teachers are actually putting that into practice in their everyday classroom practice. So for example, artificial intelligence, we have 53% of teachers thinking that yes, this is important for language teachers, but only 30% said that it's actually a part of their practice. So we have percentage difference there of 23%. Critical pedagogies, 50% said they thought that was important, but it's only part of a practice, 36% of teachers. We can see also education for sustainability quite near the top there. Teacher well-being, interestingly, important, but maybe not so many teachers actually practicing or thinking about their well-being. And again, learner agency. And then at the bottom, we have these 3 where actually there are more teachers including these things in their practice than people who think it's actually important. So again, we have the topics that people considered important and the percentage of people who considered those things to be important. And then if these are covered in teacher education, and remember here, we're not talking about only pre-service education, we're also talking about in-service teacher education, continuing professional development programs as well. So again, we have artificial intelligence at the top there. 53% said it was important, but it's only covered in teacher education according to 31%. And I have to emphasize again that artificial intelligence is the new kid on the block. And especially when we did this a year ago, people were just catching up maybe with this idea, and it hadn't actually been incorporated in much teacher education yet. So we have quite a difference with a lot of these topics between the ones that are considered important and whether they actually are covered in teacher education. Inclusion and diversity, we have there the same percentage of people who think it's important to it being covered in teacher education. And then we have the ones that are perhaps more covered in teacher education than we think people consider important. And we have reflective practice, teacher research, assessment for learning, and teaching practice there at the bottom. And as I said before, I think maybe that's because they are so embedded in teacher education that perhaps their importance is not considered so great. So first of all, let's think about some of the implications of what we found, both through the desk-based review, but also through the survey for the framework. So we know that this framework is used in many different places, many different countries, but also many different contexts within those countries, and it's used by many different audiences. So yes, it's used by individual teachers, but it's also used by schools to develop CPD or teacher education programs for their teachers. It's used by governments, it's used by ministries of education to help them develop curriculums. It's used by universities to develop courses for pre-service and in-service education. So context, it's used in many different contexts, but also we've seen how important context is. And therefore, we deem that context should really be an integral part of this framework. It was a part of the original framework, but not in such an obvious way, I think. So it was sort of there, but it wasn't really foregrounded in the original framework. We've also seen that actually teachers' needs, learner needs are changing so quickly, and therefore the framework needed to be more flexible so that it could adapt to these changing needs. And we saw how none of these practices actually exist in isolation, so that they're all interconnected. So a lot of the research that we were looking at was not about one particular thing, but was about several different things, and they were all integrated together. So digital technologies, for example, in particular, is linked to lots of different things, whether that's inclusion, and whether that's things like reading. So we can't look at these practices in isolation. Now, we wanted to come up with a sort of dynamic framework somehow that managed to capture these interconnections, but also a framework that was flexible enough to grow with the emerging needs of both teachers and learners and teacher educators as time goes on. So we wanted to make this framework fit for purpose for at least the next 10 years and maybe even more.